friends, and welcome back to another video. So even though it is Monday, we are technically not going to be working in the sketchbook today, but I wanted to show you guys a few little, preliminary sketches or planning that I did of these little cute drinks, because I wanted to do an attempt of a few illustrations today with watercolors, and I wanted to kind of like pre-plan those colors and kind of the designs of the drinks prior to working on it. So before we jump in, the lovely people at Arrtx actually sent me one of their watercolor sketchbooks for me to try out, and they have like a bunch of different versions, but I specifically chose this particular one because of the size as well as the type of watercolor paper. I always like the patterning that they have for a lot of their packaging and products, and this one's really cute with the red and the blue, but this particular watercolor sketchbook has 100% cotton, and it's kind of like a 300 GSM for the weight of the paper, which is one of my favorites. So one thing I do appreciate is the fact that the spine of the sketchbook is not attached to the cover all the way, so it kind of allows it to sit more flat, and you can kind of see like where the binding is, and the fact that you will be able to kind of like press down on the paper and lay it as flat as possible. I do notice that you might still have to use some binder clips to make sure to keep the papers kind of in place, as well as they have perforated lines on each of the pages so that if you want to, you can definitely tear them out so you can frame them or send them to people and you don't have to let them stay in your book forever. I'll talk a little bit more about just like the general use of watercolor paper and my thoughts and feelings about it in a little bit, but to kind of like preface the illustrations, I did end up making like this little alcohol marker drawing of my OC Kaisen with this kind of cute soda drink, and I wanted to do a few more with some of my other OCs. So starting off with the palette Color ENO, we're going to do kind of a rough sketch of what I wanted from, I guess, like based on the sketches that I did earlier in my sketchbook. So today I am using, or not using a different method, I am just sketching directly on the watercolor paper and wanting to see how well the texture or the paper holds up from me doing a lot of erasing, and or just like, you know, maybe with the pressure that I'm using with a pencil, am I indenting the paper, like all that stuff. Because typically when I do watercolor paintings that I want to do like a little bit more planning and prep for, I like to do a transfer of my sketch from a digital sketch. So I would actually use a light pad, which I could use for these ones because these are more like loose leaf kind of pages in the sketchbook rather than the watercolor blocks that I've used in the past. But you can also make your own makeshift kind of carbon paper as well, which I've done plenty of times in the past whenever doing watercolor illustrations. So I ended up sketching with the red colored for the palette Color ENO, and I wanted to make Masaki's drink first. I ended up doing more of like a cream soda-esque type of drink, and I was not loving where I put Masaki in terms of like the placement of the drink. I was gonna have him like kind of peeping out from the side of the drink, but I didn't like the idea that he's clinging and just kind of floating, so I wanted to ground him near the bottom of the drink. So I have him kind of looking up. It's kind of like a side profile view. He's kind of like gripping the side of the cup and he's just looking up at it in a cute little pose. So I ended up going with this. A bit later, you're gonna see the second drink, and I am gonna struggle with not liking that one all too much. So we're gonna bear with that once we get there. But once I have kind of like the red sketch finish, I'm going to go ahead and use a kneaded eraser, and don't mind how dirty my kneaded eraser looks like right now. I ended up erasing with like a just normal white eraser just to pick up as much pigment as I could off the paper, and it held up pretty well, so that's quite nice that it didn't really pill the paper, it didn't really damage the paper from using either of these erasers. But I'm using the kneaded eraser mostly just to lighten up my sketch so that I can move on and do a cleaner and more darker sketch with just an HB Mechanical Pencil, so that I have lines that won't accidentally get covered, or in the worst case scenario, I'll lose my lines because the palette Color ENO is water soluble, so it will dissolve if I put too much liquid or water or whatever on the page. So I want to be able to see my lines while I'm painting, so we're using the pencil to kind of give me a little bit more structure and a way for me not to get too lost when painting. So I went ahead and just started to trace basically over top of some of my red lines, making sure that I'm kind of like only picking the lines that I actually want to have outlines later, because for the most part, if I end up with like a fairly dark color palette or I concentrate the paint, some of my pencil lines will also disappear, but a lot of my pencil lines of like what I'm putting down right now will get covered later on by watercolor paint that's like a little bit darker, because I like doing the actual line art with watercolors to give it slightly a softer look and then giving it a little bit of contrast here and there. But after that, I went ahead and added kind of like where I wanted my highlights to be, alongside with like any whites or anything with the red mechanical pencil, so we can kind of block out where I shouldn't add paint, just to keep the integrity of like the white of the page as clean as possible. You can kind of still see a lot of the red lines, so when I was using the kneaded eraser, I was just lightly kind of like buffing it out. Like I mentioned, a lot of the red will get dissolved anyways when I add paint or water, so we can kind of buff those out if it becomes a little bit too distracting. And then as for the paint, I am using the Paul Rubens watercolor set, and then for brushes I am going to be using the Arrtx travel sized watercolor brushes because they fit nicely into this tin, and because I don't really have like a specific brush that I like using as of right now, I found that these ones actually work pretty well. So this one, the blue one, or the blue version, is a size 8, and then I have a yellow version which is a size 2, I believe. So it's kind of like nice to have two different sizes. I do like the fact that the body or the cap can transform to make it like a longer brush, which makes it a little bit more comfortable to paint, as well as keeping it nice and secure so your brushes don't, or like the bristles don't get damaged at all. So even though I ended up doing like kind of like preliminary planning in my sketchbook, I did end up using the same watercolor palette to plan out the colors. So I had like a general idea of how I wanted Masaki's drink to kind of look in terms of like the colors. So at the very beginning, I started off with a very light wash, kind of a yellow, and making sure that my paint and my page, or like my watercolor paper, stays a little bit wet, so that once we start adding other colors, we can kind of let them bleed into one another, which I do like testing this out to see how fast the dry time is for the watercolor paper versus like other brands, because every watercolor paper I feel like behaves a little bit differently. So I found that this one doesn't dry as quickly, so it was easier for me to add in more gradations or letting the colors bleed into one another, which was very nice. So to kind of like keep up the efficiency of my painting, I do try my best to leave some areas to dry while I work on other areas, so that once I come back, we can just continuously keep painting without having to take too many breaks, because I think this one took me maybe an hour and a half to paint, and I actually really like Masaki's quite a bit, especially with the colors. So the plan was, in terms of the illustration, is that I like the colors of a cream soda, and I feel like they match Masaki actually quite well, because if I add a little bit more of like blue tones into it, then we can kind of hit the turquoise-ish kind of color scheme, and then keep kind of like the light green. I added a little bit of yellow to bring a little bit more brightness into it to make sure it kind of fits Masaki's color palette. And then I switched out those maraschino cherries for a little strawberry, because I feel like Masaki is more of like a strawberry kind of boy rather than like cherries for like a cream soda. And I think the pink looks really cute with this kind of like blue green, and it fits Masaki a little bit better than just like a straight up red that's like slightly fluorescent, kind of darkish. So I just ended up switching it out because I thought it would look a little bit cuter and make the color palette have like a little bit pop of like a reddish pink. I'm sure the cherry would have looked fine as well. And then at the very top of our drink, I wanted to include a little, I guess it is the ice cream, but it had a little bit of maybe like whipping cream or something on top as well. So I added a little like foam Hansuke, who's like the little green cat that I used to draw quite a bit with Masaki at the time. And I thought it was just a cute touch to make it a little bit more personal to Masaki's drink, because initially I was gonna go with like a matcha color, but I was just not in love with making it more of like an earthier green. I wanted something a little bit more cute and vibrant, and allowing me to test out a bunch of different color combinations and taking advantage of the fact that this paper does have a nice dry time for me to work with, especially working with like gradations and working with wet on wet. And I think it worked out quite nicely in terms of like getting the darker, richer colors and leaving some of that texture for the drink at the bottom, so that it's not just like one smooth look for the colors. Hopefully that makes sense. Then when I had kind of like the base of our drink pretty much done, I went ahead and added some washes to Masaki as well. And for this paper, I felt while I was working on Masakis, because of how sure I was about laying down my colors, I wasn't using like an over absorbent amount of like water. I did find that this had not too much buckling, and I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the video that 300 GSM watercolor in general tends to be my favorite, and I don't like typically going lower than 300 GSM for watercolor paper if I am like painting on the go, or I don't want to like tape my watercolor paper sheet down to a surface to kind of like prevent it from buckling. So the thicker the paper, the kind of better for myself to prevent too much warping. So like I mentioned earlier is the fact that when I was doing the majority of the painting of the drink itself, I wasn't using too much water because there was a lot of like leeway time in terms of letting myself have the colors bleed into one another, because the paper doesn't absorb the watercolor super quickly, which, you know, I feel like different watercolor paper, you're gonna have to test how quickly the paint or water absorbs into the paper. So you definitely need to test whether or not it's more suitable for like doing larger washes, and you have to make sure you keep your paper nice and wet to get very soft gradations or very soft color transitions versus something a little bit harsher. You can kind of see like at the bottom of the drink, there's some like more feathered-ish darker colors, and that's because I did wait a fair amount for the paper to actually dry before adding in the color to let it just more like feather out rather than seamlessly transition, which is also like another way if you want to add texture or you don't really mind not having a very smooth gradation. And then for the most part, the texture of the paper is just very smooth. I don't find any like weird bumps, no weird patterning, nothing like of that sort. So that's kind of like one of my favorite reasons of using something like hot press paper, is the fact that it has lack of texture. So while I'm working with doing line art like I'm doing right now, I'm not having any areas where my brush is snagging on the paper. So I do like the fact that this one actually is a very smooth hot press paper. I like the weight of it. I think 24 sheets is actually very generous in terms of like sheets of watercolor paper. That sometimes like watercolor journals or watercolor sketchbooks tend to have fewer paper, I believe. So it's kind of nice being able to have 24 sheets, but I believe the paper is also double-sided, so you can paint on both sides, and that's kind of like another reason I opted to sketch directly on top of our sketchbook paper, or watercolor paper in this case, because I don't want to have to shine a light through my illustration and have that silhouette pop through while I'm transferring the design. So I just want to see if this could be a watercolor sketchbook that I can just doodle and draw in and just paint whatever without having too much pressure. And yeah, the paper holds up very, very well. I like the texture of it. The dry time is very manageable for me, so I really like it. And the one thing I don't really talk about is kind of the sketchbook size. So this one is like bigger than A5. So A5 is about like 5.5 or like 5 by 7. I don't really remember the dimensions like in inches, but this one is a little bit bigger. And I do like that because I don't want to work too small, but it's not too large where it's like super intimidating. But I mentioned at the very beginning of the video that Arrtx actually has a few other sketchbooks, watercolor sketchbooks of like, I think there's like a different size for hot press paper, as well as they have two that are cold press paper. So I think if you have like a certain preference for size and or the type of watercolor paper, then you can definitely check out Arrtx to see whether or not those are suitable for your needs. I'm always in the need for like a new watercolor sketchbook because I want to be able to paint a lot more, especially for the last remaining part of this year. I've been just really getting into watercolor again, and I always like the vibrancy of like the watercolor pieces and like playing around with lighting and playing around with color and being able to just paint freely without too much pressure. So in the past, I've used like watercolor blocks, and those are really nice. And I love the fact that, you know, you don't have to tape down your sheet. You don't have to worry about keeping your page like super flat before it starts to buckle and stuff because it's gummed on all sides. But this one definitely feels a little bit more freeing for me. I can treat it actually just as a sketchbook. Maybe I can do swatches in here, planning, thumbnailing, all of that. So Yeah, I probably will use this one actually quite a bit in the future, just because the size and the paper, and I don't know, just it feels very comfortable to work with in my opinion. But let's talk a little bit about the illustration before we finish off this particular one. So for some of the little bubbles in the drink, and I forgot to add like little condensation droplets on the outside, but I ended up going back in with a little bit of white gouache to bring out some of the highlights. Now this gouache isn't super, I don't know, vibrant in terms of like wanting to pull out some of the highlights. Granted, the areas that I wanted to add more highlights were already very light in value, so maybe that's another reason it didn't stand out as much. But I wanted to add a little bit more bubbles into the inside of the drink. Added a little bit of detailing to the strawberry because I lost a lot of it. And then last but not least, I ended up adding a little bit like of a matcha powder look to the top of like the little Hansuke whipped cream thing, because I needed to add a little bit of green to him to match the design. And then last but not least, I added a little bit of blush and extra shading to Masaki before I ended up finishing off this entire illustration, which is definitely one of my favorites in a long time in terms of doing like a watercolor painting. This one actually reminds me of way back when, I don't know how many people used to watch my older videos, but I used to do a lot of like little illustration of flowers that Masaki would carry in this little backpack type thing, like as if he was like very tiny and collecting flowers. So I used to do like a series of illustrations of just purely that. I might get back into it because I miss it, and it'd be kind of fun to do like flower studies with that concept in mind in this particular sketchbook. That, or I want to do like a few more drinks maybe and get a little bit of redemption for the next one. So while this one of Masaki is actually finally finished, you can kind of see how much the paper actually buckled. It actually isn't too bad. So I'm going to be able to work on the back side, which I believe has the same texture as the front. I didn't really have too much of an issue of painting on both sides, at least at the time when I was painting. I didn't really notice too big of a difference. But we are going to be working on the flip side. So to make sure that the paper still lies flat, I ended up bending the cover up until it flattens out with that side of the paper, and then sticking a little coaster on the very bottom to make sure that my page doesn't bend down all the way. That way we can kind of keep it as a flat surface. But the next drink I want to do is one for Selwyn, which I struggled to think of what kind of drink he would have. So ended up merging a few drinks together. It is more akin to a cream soda once again, except for I wanted a gradation in his drink from almost like a clear-ish color to a pink to a purple bluish color. So I'm gonna attempt to do that. I ended up putting like a little star fruit at the very top and then an orange slice, because the reference I was following had orange as like the fruit of choice. It was like on the side of the cup inside the drink, and then I don't know, this one I did struggle with, so I'll talk about it once we get to the process. But speaking about the paper again, because this is kind of like the main focus of the video, is talking about this watercolor sketchbook, and I do recommend it. And another thing that I really like about this one in particular compared to ones that I used to use a long time ago is the fact that when I bought any type of watercolor journal that had very specific type of paper, I think I used to use a cold press paper for a very long time in a kind of like a hardcover journal or like a soft cover journal. Then I bought a hot press papered one. The thing that I noticed is that the front page, or like one side of the watercolor paper, had the correct texture, and then the back side had a different texture. And you could paint on both sides, but it didn't react in the same way. So typically I think you were going to actually work, let's say if you had 24 sheets, then you can only do 24 drawings, or like use up 24 sheets as is and not use the back side, unless you didn't mind it having like a drastically different texture and it doesn't absorb in the same way. I'm sure it's because the back side maybe doesn't have the same sizing as the front side, but I did notice that this paper, at least from what I could tell, pretty much had no difference from the front and the back side of the paper, which I think is great. I could use front and back no problem, and the watercolor I'm pretty sure behaved the same way. And the reason for uncertainty, which I think because I will use this more in the future, I will definitely have a definitive answer. But for now, from doing just the two test illustrations, The only reason I can't give like a definitive answer right now is what I'm trying to say is because I just don't like how I approached this piece. I wanted to give the illusion that this little orange lemon slice thing was like within the liquid, but I didn't give it enough transparency. And then I also struggled with the fact that more or less like blue and purple is kind of like the complementary color to orange and yellow, so I was getting a very muddy color right off the bat, and I think I should have just added the wash very lightly of what color drink I wanted, and then added in the color of the orange slice, and then slowly layered it up that way. Instead of struggling to like continuously add like blue darker and darker, and the way that I was impatiently layering up the color was not exactly great, so it's gonna look extremely patchy for quite a while. But for the most part, like other areas like the little ice cream scoop at the very top, I think is very much the same way how I typically paint, as well as the bottom of the glass. So I'm pretty sure, like I'm like 90% sure, which is not great, but it's like high enough, I think, that the front and the back page of the watercolor paper has the same texture and behaves the same way. So the bottom line is what I'm saying is that with these 24 sheets, I can get 48 drawings out of it rather than just using 24 if I was trying to avoid the backside, which I don't need to do, which I think is great. So one kind of like thing I kind of wish this paper would do a little bit better is the way that it's binded or bound, is the fact that it does not lay completely flat without the help of using, let's say, binder clips or something to weigh it down. It has like a little bit of resistance in terms of if you try to open it, it kind of slowly closes back up. And like I mentioned, as long as you have something to weigh it down, or you're holding it, or you don't mind the fact that maybe one side will lift up while you're working on the other side, then I don't think it's like a super big deal. Nor is it like a deal breaker for me, because I do like the idea of just having a watercolor sketchbook just has functioning paper. I don't think the spine or the papers kind of like close on itself too drastically to the point of like, oh, I feel annoyed of having to prop it up or like having to clip it down all the time, because I know myself and I will always clip down the paper most likely to prevent buckling. So, you know, letting it stay open or close or whatever, it's not too big of a deal for me. But it might be something for you to consider if that's something that might annoy you. I also think that because it does have perforated lines, you can definitely tear out the pieces instead and have them lay flat rather than have them be kind of like treated just as a sketchbook. So whatever your preference is, I think either way works actually quite well. But let me jump back in and talk about the illustration before we end the video. So this one, I did have the same problem in terms of when I was sketching. I did not want Selwyn to be on the side of the drink. I more or less centered the drink, which is kind of a bad idea on my part because I gave no room for Selwyn and I didn't really want to cover the front of the drink too much. So instead of like giving him the exact same pose as Maseki, which might have been a better idea, I ended up having him like squat and sit on the floor of like the base of our cup. And my sketch was a little derpy, and maybe I was rushing the sketch a little bit, but once I started to paint him, I was also just impatient. And I think it came from the fact that I was getting frustrated with the gradation and trying to make it look cute and not liking how cloudy it looked, and the colors were just not the way that I wanted it to be. So I might reattempt this. Heck, I might reattempt it literally on the page next to it, with maybe a slightly different pose for Selwyn, so he looks a little bit less derpy. But because I was getting a little frustrated with laying down the colors, I was not getting the right paint to water ratio when painting Selwyn, so his lines are messy. A lot of the, I don't know, the lines or like the color I lay was a little bit too transparent, so he looks almost washed out. I also didn't let things dry properly, so some of the colors just bled into one another. Oh, that's another thing I forgot to talk about. Color lifting. I think the color lifting on this paper actually is very easy. I don't know about the staining property of the paint on this particular paper, but I did notice that me laying down or trying to scrub away some of the paint and lifting it up with a paper towel actually was fairly easy for me to do. So I definitely think that if you make a mistake and you want to be able to lift a color, then you don't really have to worry about it because it's very forgiving in my opinion. Especially for like a hot press paper. I think cold press tends to be more forgiving. On a different note, I will do a redemption of Selwyn at some point. I might do it off camera, I might do it for a stream, who knows. But if you guys want to see me do more OC illustrations with these little cute drinks, then do let me know, or maybe I'll do some that are more like floral based like I used to do for Masaki. But other than that, if you're interested in checking out any of the watercolor sketchbooks that Arrtx has to offer, do check out the links in the description or check out their website. Thank you again to Arrtx for sending me this watercolor sketchbook to try out, and I will talk to you guys probably next time in the next video. But in the meantime, I will probably plan out a few more drinks anyways, because this was actually very fun to do. So yeah, I think that's it for today, and talk to you guys next time. Bye!